What happens when a love story the world believes in is quietly falling apart behind closed doors? For years, fans of 90 Day Fiancé watched Alexei Brovarnik and Loren Brovarnik grow from a cross-border romance into what seemed like one of the franchise's strongest marriages. They laughed together. They built a family. They convinced millions that love could survive cultural differences, stress, and time. But according to information from a confidential source close to the family, the reality was far more complicated. Behind smiling Instagram photos and polished public appearances, cracks were forming. There were disputes over finances, heated arguments about trust, secrets heavy enough to threaten everything they built. On November 15th, 2025, that quiet breakdown became official. Without a public announcement, without a joint statement, without explanation, Alexei and Loren were legally divorced. What followed shocked even people close to them. A hidden relationship kept secret for over a year. An undisclosed debt reportedly totaling $900,000. A woman named Tori, whose roots trace back to India and whose involvement would change Alexei's life permanently. And then, an upcoming wedding plan for January 20th, 2026, just months after the divorce. But the story did not stop there. As court documents surfaced, another twist emerged. Loren filed a defamation lawsuit against the man she once trusted with her life. The result, a guilty ruling, a 1-year prison sentence, and a public image permanently changed. This is not just a story about love. It is a story about secrecy, debt, power, and the cost of betrayal. To understand how everything collapsed, we must first understand what the world saw. Alexei and Loren were presented as a success story, proof that a relationship formed under unusual circumstances could last beyond the cameras. From navigating cultural differences to building a family, their journey felt real and hopeful. Fans saw Alexei as calm and dependable. Loren was outspoken and emotional, often described as the heart of the relationship. Together, they seemed balanced. But according to those familiar with their private life, the harmony shifted long before the public noticed. Disagreements over money reportedly increased after major lifestyle changes. The pressure of maintaining a public image combined with growing financial responsibilities created tension that never appeared on screen. Friends noticed fewer joint appearances. Family events felt strained. Conversations that once felt warm became practical and distant. Behind the scenes, Alexei was reportedly managing a financial obligation he had not fully shared, a debt that continued to grow quietly. Loren sensed stress, but not deception. She believed challenges were temporary. She believed love would steady them. What she did not know was that Alexei had already begun living two realities. One as a devoted husband and father, another as a man searching for financial relief at any cost. It was during this fragile period that a new name entered the story. Tori. At first, she was invisible to the public, unknown to fans, unacknowledged inside the marriage, but her presence was already shifting the future. Long before lawyers became involved, the marriage was under strain, not because of one explosive event, but because of accumulated silence. Early warning signs seemed ordinary. Arguments about spending, tension over long-term plans, discussions that ended without resolution. Alexei, once steady and predictable, reportedly became withdrawn. Conversations shortened. Answers felt defensive. When Loren asked about money and stress, she was told everything was under control. But it was not. What made the situation more fragile was how well it was hidden publicly. They continued to share photos. They smiled at events. They maintained the image of unity. Behind closed doors, however, the tone changed. Sources claim Alexei began taking calls he would not explain, reading messages privately, taking trips that felt unnecessary. Loren noticed the distance but attributed it to pressure. She believed they were in a difficult season, not a crisis. What she did not realize was that those silences were filled with decisions made without her. Financial discussions became more intense. Loren wanted transparency. Alexei asked for time. Each conversation ended in frustration. The emotional gap widened, not because love vanished, but because trust weakened. Friends later said Loren felt something was wrong, but could not identify it. She sensed secrecy, but not another relationship. By the time she began asking direct questions about unexplained expenses and unusual financial arrangements, the line had already been crossed. Alexei was not just hiding stress. He was hiding consequences. Arguments shifted from money to honesty, from budgeting to respect. The deeper question became whether the marriage was still a partnership or had quietly become a performance. This was the moment where truth could have changed the outcome. But silence continued. And in that silence, another presence grew stronger. Still private, still unnamed in public conversations, but increasingly central in Alexei's life. The cracks were no longer forming. They were spreading. Every secret carries weight. And the one Alexei was carrying was growing heavier by the day. Alexei was carrying a weight heavy enough to crush an entire family. According to information later uncovered during legal proceedings, Alexei had been living under the pressure of a $900,000 financial obligation. The debt had grown slowly and quietly, completely outside his wife's knowledge. Its origins were never publicly discussed during the marriage, but sources described it as a mix of failed investments, private loans, and desperate financial decisions. What made the situation explosive was not just the amount. It was the silence. For months, possibly longer, Alexei allegedly worked to keep the debt hidden. Bills were redirected. Accounts were separated. Financial questions were met with vague answers and calm reassurances that everything was temporary and under control. It was not under control. Interest increased. Deadlines approached. Options became fewer. The debt was no longer just a financial issue. It threatened his identity as a provider, his public image, and the dependable role people believed he held. Sources close to the situation said the pressure changed him. His sleep became irregular. His decisions grew impulsive. Problems that might have been solved through honesty now felt impossible to admit. Instead of turning toward his marriage, Alexei turned away from it. This was the moment when secrecy became strategy. Rather than telling Loren the truth and facing the consequences together, he allegedly began searching for an external solution. Someone who could fix the financial crisis without destroying the life he had built. The search did not begin with romance. It began with survival. At that point, Alexei was focused on protecting himself. He believed survival meant keeping the debt hidden at any cost, even if it meant changing his future completely. Meanwhile, Loren sensed something was wrong, but she did not understand the scale. She believed the stress came from work and family responsibilities. She could not imagine a number large enough to destroy everything overnight. By the time small pieces of truth began to surface, financial inconsistencies, unexplained urgency, it was already too late. The debt had reached a point where there was no easy return. And soon, someone would offer him a way out. There were no public scandals, no obvious signs pointing to another woman. On the surface, nothing looked different. According to sources familiar with the timeline, Tori entered Alexei's life when he was at his most vulnerable. She was not introduced as romance. She was introduced as help. Their early conversations were practical. He allegedly confided in her about his financial situation. She listened. Then she made an offer that changed everything. Sources claim Tori agreed to cover the entire $900,000 debt. Not as a loan, not as temporary support, as a permanent settlement. There was one condition: commitment, marriage. For Alexei, the decision crossed every boundary at once. On one side was his wife, his children, his reputation. On the other side was freedom from financial collapse. What makes this part unsettling is how quietly it unfolded. There were no immediate separations, no sudden announcements. Alexei continued living as a husband while building a different future in private. The connection with Tori gradually moved from financial discussions to emotional reliance. What began as desperation became attachment, and with attachment came justification. He allegedly convinced himself that the marriage was already damaged. That emotional distance meant permission. That solving the debt was protecting his family, even if they never knew. But Loren was still there, still believing the marriage could be repaired, still trying to understand the growing distance. Tori's involvement deepened. Conversations about relocation began. Marriage plans were quietly discussed. Dates were considered carefully around legal timing rather than emotional readiness. Her roots in India were open, and they became part of the imagined future. Alexei began picturing a new beginning far from questions and exposure. By the time the relationship crossed from agreement into betrayal, the choice had already been made. He chose the path that erased his debt, even if it erased his marriage. For nearly a year, Alexei lived two lives. Outwardly, he remained a husband and father. He attended family events. He maintained routines. Nothing appeared broken. Privately, another life was unfolding. Phone calls were taken alone. Messages were deleted. Financial steps were made independently. Every day required careful balance. The emotional cost became visible. He grew more irritable and distant. Conversations lacked warmth. Disagreements ended quickly. Emotional closeness faded. Not because love disappeared in a single moment, but because his attention had shifted. Tori was now deeply involved in planning and legal preparation. As the debt was settled piece by piece, Alexei felt relief. But that relief came with obligation. The more the burden lifted, the more committed he became to the promise he had made. Sources say he justified his choices. He told himself Loren would eventually be better off, that revealing the truth would cause more harm. That timing mattered more than honesty. But lies grow. Loren felt the change before she saw evidence. He was present physically but emotionally distant. When she asked what was wrong, the answers felt rehearsed. Stress, work, pressure. She tried to repair what she believed was normal strain. She gave space. She offered support. She waited. That patience gave him time. Time to separate finances. Time to plan legally. Time to detach emotionally. By the end of the year, the marriage still existed on paper, but not in reality. The most important decisions had already been made. On November 15th, 2025, the marriage ended quietly. There were no dramatic announcements, no emotional social media posts, just paperwork. According to those familiar with the process, the divorce was handled carefully and privately. Friends were not warned. The public was not prepared. One day they appeared married. The next, it was over. For Loren, the moment reportedly felt unreal. Sources say she was informed after major decisions had already been arranged. What she expected to be another difficult conversation became confirmation that the marriage was ending. The emotional distance she had tried to close was now legal and final. The documents were clear. The signatures were decisive. After the signatures were finalized and the divorce legally complete, the aftermath began to settle in. What might have seemed like a single, quiet decision on paper was, in reality, the collapse of a life carefully constructed over years. For Loren, it was not just a marriage ending. It was the erasure of a shared identity. The sudden revelation that the life she had been living with Alexei was only partially real. Friends describe her as stunned, numb, and trying to reconcile the version of her marriage she believed in with the truth that had just been revealed. The public, of course, had no clue. On social media, the images remained, the smiling family portraits, the curated snapshots of domestic bliss, the celebrations of birthdays and holidays. Fans believed the same fairy tale they had for years. Behind the closed doors, however, Loren was left facing the fallout of months, even years of deception. Every routine, every conversation she had thought meaningful, now carried the weight of betrayal. Each affectionate gesture Alexei had made on camera or in private was filtered through the lens of manipulation, making it impossible to separate truth from performance. Meanwhile, Alexei had begun to solidify his future with Tori. Their arrangement, which began as a financial rescue, had evolved into a fully planned path forward. The debt settlement, which seemed at first like a lifeline, had become the foundation for a new marriage. Tori, whose roots were in India, now stood at the center of Alexei's future, legally and socially, even as Loren attempted to piece together her own shattered life. The legal documents revealed more than just divorce. They outlined settlements, custody arrangements, and, crucially, the financial transfers that had quietly occurred between Alexei and Tori. Reports suggest that the $900,000 debt was fully resolved through Tori's intervention, leaving Alexei free from the obligations that had governed his secret life. In effect, this financial arrangement had rewritten reality. The man who had appeared stable, dependable, and loving to fans and family alike had been operating in secret, prioritizing survival and self-interest above marriage vows. For Loren, the consequences were both emotional and practical. She had invested not only her love and trust, but also her energy, her career stability, and her sense of identity in the relationship. The divorce forced her to reconsider every decision she had made in support of Alexei. How could the house she had maintained, the vacation she had planned, and the future she had imagined have been built on partial truths? Each memory was now tainted, each shared experience reframed as part of a hidden narrative she had never been allowed to see. The timeline also revealed that the relationship with Tori had been carefully coordinated to overlap with the end of the marriage, ensuring minimal interference and no public scrutiny. According to insiders, Alexei had anticipated the legal and emotional fallout of the divorce and had orchestrated the timeline to ensure that his financial and personal escape was as clean as possible. This was not impulsive or emotional behavior. This was calculated strategy. Court documents and private statements later showed that Tori had been a significant factor in the financial and emotional planning. Her involvement was not limited to paying off debts. She had advised Alexei on legal approaches, on the timing of documents, and on managing appearances. In effect, Tori's participation turned what might have been a chaotic unraveling into a controlled, managed operation. For Alexei, this created a sense of security and loyalty, one he had not felt in months or even years with Loren. The emotional weight for Loren, however, continued to build. Friends describe her as moving through a fog of betrayal, trying to reconcile the fact that the man she had trusted implicitly had not only lied, but had done so for an extended period. Each revelation, the debt, the hidden relationship, the financial maneuvers, added layers to her understanding of the deception. Psychologists consulted by insiders suggest that such cumulative betrayal can have long-lasting effects, including anxiety, self-doubt, and difficulty forming trust in future relationships. Loren was now faced with not just legal reality, but the psychological aftermath of a life carefully manipulated from the inside out. Meanwhile, Alexei and Tori's future moved forward in a way that was almost seamless. Sources report that their engagement and eventual wedding in January 2026 had been carefully timed to coincide with legal finalities and to avoid public interference. The new partnership represented a clean break from the past. The debt resolved, the marriage legally dissolved, and the path forward entirely controlled by Alexei and Tori. What might have seemed impulsive or opportunistic to outsiders was, in reality, a meticulously coordinated plan. The media began to pick up on the story only after documents were filed and the divorce was official. Public reaction was swift. Fans who had long celebrated Alexei and Loren as a model couple were shocked, disbelieving, and in many cases, deeply hurt. Social media became a forum for speculation and judgment, with commenters questioning not only Alexei's choices, but also the very narrative of reality television itself. How much of what they had watched for years had been genuine? How much had been performance, carefully edited and curated to maintain appearances, while real-life betrayals unfolded? From a legal perspective, the consequences continued to unfold. The divorce proceedings and financial settlements were only the beginning. Loren Brovarnik later filed a defamation lawsuit against Alexei, citing public misrepresentation and the emotional damage caused by the hidden relationships and financial deceptions. Court rulings eventually affirmed her claims, resulting in a guilty verdict and a 1-year prison sentence for Alexei, further complicating his public image and personal future. The courtroom drama made the private betrayal suddenly public, creating layers of consequence that extended far beyond the original marriage. Psychologically, both Alexei and Loren faced intense scrutiny and personal reckoning. Alexei's life, once carefully curated, was now under examination for his choices, motivations, and ethical boundaries. Loren, on the other hand, began the long process of reconstructing a life interrupted by deception. Therapy, personal reflection, and support networks became critical to helping her navigate the fallout. Friends and family describe her as determined to rebuild, to reclaim autonomy and to ensure that the betrayal did not define the rest of her life. The story of Alexei and Loren illustrates how complex human relationships can be when layered with secrecy, financial pressure, and manipulation. What had appeared as a happy marriage to the world was, in private, a carefully managed performance. The public images, the shared events, the moments of affection were all filtered through a lens of strategic decision-making, designed to protect one party while undermining the other. Ultimately, the narrative challenges the perception of reality television itself. Fans learn that curated appearances can hide profound truths. Money, power, and control can operate quietly, altering lives without immediate detection. The consequences, emotional